Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and on today's podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation. A lot of folks just aren't aware of what the different fish and game agencies, game and fish agencies across the nation do for wildlife. And they're often getting bad press from anti-hunters along with our own hunting community who kind of is always dissatisfied with their hunt or how it's being managed. So I think it's beneficial to talk about how game agencies work and some of the work that they do, and also talk about what hunters do and how they contribute, because these are the things that aren't covered in mainstream, that are often overlooked. And instead, what gets targeted or promoted is anti-hunting type of content. So I wanted to take a little information and share it with you from Arizona Wildlife Views, which is a periodical that I get in the mail that I appreciate. It's good stuff. Here's a little picture of it. I know some of the folks that work in Arizona. I've done work with them and projects with them, and I really do like how Arizona manages their game. We've had Jim Deere, a deer biologist, on the podcast a few times from Arizona Game and Fish. He's great, Arizona Fish and Game. I'm going to read a little bit about this conservation effort on water that Arizona has gone through. So it says, water for wildlife. Arizona is in its 22nd year of long-term drought. For wildlife, this means less drinking water and a bigger fight for survival, especially during dry summers. The Arizona Game and Fish Department maintains 3,000 water catchments, or man-made watering sites, built in remote locations around the state to provide necessary hydration for wildlife. That's 3,000 water catchments. Arizona's been going through, it says, 22 years of long-term drought. That is a long drought. They talk about how they're managing that for wildlife. And so it says, last year, the public graciously donated to Arizona Game and Fish Department's watering project, which helped pay for 1,000-gallon water trailer. Public support covered half the cost of a new 1,000-gallon water trailer, which is instrumental in the department's work to fill water catchments throughout the year. Also, the money from the public allowed 2 water trucks. Arizona Game and Fish Department rented 2 additional water trucks for 2 months to keep up with demand and ensure this important work wasn't delayed. 85,000 gallons of water. Brent, that's a lot of water. The cost to haul 50 truckloads of water, that's a whopping 85,000 gallons, was aided by donations. And then flying water to bighorn sheep. Donations provided matching funds to fly water to 2 bighorn sheep water catchments. That's pretty remarkable. And that's an example of the game and fish agencies working with the public to do things to help wildlife. Frankly, the wildlife in Arizona would be screwed if there weren't man-made water catchments throughout the West there. And these things take a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to get water to these places and to keep that water flowing. So when someone complains about the cost of an elk tag to go hunt in Arizona, or it's hard to draw a tag or whatnot, there's a lot of money that goes into making that resource exist. And part of it, and a lot of it, needs to be funded by hunters and tag sales. So I think often we overlook the work that's being done. Another good example of work being done in Arizona is this Squirrel Conservation, this squirrel project. So Arizona is home to an endangered species of squirrel. And squirrels just don't get the kind of love that a mountain lion or a wolf will get, or a bison. They just don't. Yet they are tasty. I'm just going to read from this article. It says, Arizona's embattled Mount Graham red squirrel population grew 4% in 2019, providing proof that the endangered animal continues its fight back 2 years after nearly being wiped out by a devastating wildfire. The stabilization of the population during the past year comes after much of the territorial squirrel's habitat was severely damaged in 2017 by the Fry Fire in the Pinaleno Mountains in southeastern Arizona. In September, the annual survey found a minimum estimate of 78 squirrels, which is in line with the 75 squirrels found in 2018. That's rough. So you've got 78 squirrels left. after that fire. They had restored the population up to around 550. It says, much work must be done to help conserve and protect the resilient, intrepid animal, but consistent estimates of the population since the fire are encouraging for the Mount Graham's red squirrel overall recovery. This squirrel has faced significant daunting challenges, but the Arizona Game and Fish Department and our partners will continue our work to give it a fighting shot at survival. The annual population estimate is made by monitoring all known Midden locations for activity. Brent, what's a Midden location?
A Midden location?
Yep, Midden.
I would guess the middle of their habitat.
Googleize it.
Oh, where they poop.
Nope. Type in squirrel midden.
A squirrel midden is a mess of leftovers squirrels leave after eating.
No. I first learned about a midden, I think, on Stephen Rinella's Meat Eater podcast. They're big old squirrel hunting fiends over there, Meat Eater. Had a few episodes about it.
Is it where they store their food?
Yeah. The middens, areas where red squirrels store their spruce, fir, and pine cone cache for the upcoming winter.
Oh, it's their stash.
It's their stash. So they monitor the stash locations to see how many squirrels come. So it's kind of like a lecky. I believe it's called a lecky, something like that for sage grouse.
Okay.
It's kind of the area where the hotbed of activity comes. If you check that area, you're going to kind of have a pretty good count of, the squirrels in the area and what's going on.
Everyone's got to eat. They'll be back.
They said they're surveyed every fall by the Arizona Game and Fish Department, Coronado National Forest, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Arizona Center for Nature Conservation, Phoenix Zoo, and the University of Arizona. They're getting watched all over the place.
I know.
Spied on. We really appreciate the hard work that all of our partners are doing to ensure the endangered Mount Graham red squirrel continues to be part of Arizona's incredible diversity of wildlife. Ensuring its recovery will take a lot of effort, but it's through collaborations between multiple agencies and partners that will ultimately be able to recover the squirrel. The Mount Graham red squirrel is a subspecies found only in the upper elevation conifer forests of the Pinaleno Mountains. The squirrel's population peaked at about 550 in the late 1990s, but typically ranged between 200 and 300 before the fire.
Wow.
The subspecies was thought to have been extinct in the 1950s. But was rediscovered decades later and granted protection under the Endangered Species Act in 1987. Its diet consists primarily of conifer seeds, but also includes insects, mushrooms, birds, nestlings, and other items. Mount Graham red squirrels are highly territorial and will aggressively defend their middens or food cache or stash. In addition, they have lower reproductive rates and a shorter average lifespan than other subspecies of red squirrels. Further complicating its recovery are long-term impacts to squirrel habitat from high-intensity wildfires that can reduce food sources and cover from predators. There's also competition from non-native Abert's squirrels and poor cone crops caused by drought, all of which can influence population estimates. We place a high value on this partnership supporting the Mount Graham red squirrel, says Coronado National Forest Supervisor Kerwin Dewberry. This year, we've improved habitat through anti-aggregation, pheromone deployment, tree thinning, cone and seed collection for future plantings, and surveys of squirrels and tree seedling survival. Each agency brings unique talents to this effort. We're proud to be part of it. Biologists continue their research to explore new methods to help conserve the species and develop long-term forest management strategies across the fire-impacted landscape, such as reseeding and planting coniferous trees and managed care breeding program. Here's the thing, though. Who cares about a little red squirrel in the mountains of Arizona?
That's kind of what I've been sitting here thinking.
And it takes a lot of money to keep something like this from going extinct and to keep it going and to restore it.
No one's going to go out there unless they're being paid to sit there and watch a squirrel heap.
What I'm getting at is this is the sort of work that game agencies do and that wildlife agencies do across the nation. Mm-hmm. And they are trying to help all the animals, not just the ones that generate revenue. Because let's face it, this little critter is not going to bring in a whole bunch of money. What does bring in a lot of money?
Whitetail, elk, ungulates mostly.
Especially elk. In Arizona, I'd say the elk hunting, the mule deer hunting, the deer hunting.
Charismatic megafauna.
It's pretty hot. It's got to bring in some revenue. That money then needs to go across all management initiatives to keep all wildlife healthy.
If it was up to individual species to bring in their own money, we'd have a lot less animals on the landscape.
Right. It's kind of like college sports.
Yeah.
Well, what you have is you have men's football, and you have men's basketball, and they cover like the obscure track team that no one cares about. They cover the cost of a lot of sports. But if you didn't have the big hitters, you wouldn't be able to, do things like protect all wildlife. But the thing that's sort of aggravating about all of this, you don't see PETA. All we do is get vilified from the anti-hunting agencies as all we care about is killing and, it's cruel. We should find another way to manage wildlife, like we should use contraceptives instead of killing them and so on. And it's like, these are natural resources. I mean, why would you use a contraceptive when you can harvest them and eat them like nature intended? And they will still reproduce and have healthy populations. I just find it interesting because I wish they would spend more time, instead of creating anti-hunting, anti-gun content, I wish they would spend more time creating, like putting money where their mouth is and helping with these initiatives that the hunting community is deeply involved in. Yeah. From the water, and feeding, keeping these animals alive, from water for wildlife to this obscure squirrel population in the middle of nowhere. Hunters foot the bill. We put our money where our mouth is. I was watching a show the other day. I think it was on Netflix. And I want to bring it up as a topic. It's the sort of thing that will really, really get Brent all fired up. But they talk about on this show is trophy hunting bad, and it was on like NBC or something last year. And they have that woman who shot a giraffe. I swear they have a couple of hunters on there that are the worst representatives for our community. Why couldn't you have like Jim Shockey or Stephen Ranella on there?
They always want to grab Ted Nugent. Ted, you hunt? Come here, Ted.
They grab someone who makes us look a little bit just out of touch.
Ted Nugent had a TV show where he tried to hunt people on his ranch. Like, quit going to that guy. So, he's a little out there.
My point being, though, on that TV show, they were discussing the impact of hunting and how it's helped or hindered. They have this gentleman on there who has on his 4th or 5th leopard hunt. And that hunt costs like $30,000.
Yeah.
It just starts out at 30 just to be there. Yeah. And then every animal he kills costs money. And so you got to kill a fresh gazelle and a fresh zebra and a fresh.
You got to hang it from a tree.
And you got to hang it from a tree, and you got to bait this leopard.
And then you got to pay for your guides.
So you got to pay for all of that. Yeah. By the time you're done,
and then triple.
Yeah. And so what happens is they got to keep replenishing these bait sites, and
other animals get into
this
them.
guy was on like his 4th or 5th and hadn't killed a leopard yet. Each time, I don't know, he's spending like 30, 50,000 something in those ballpark numbers. And they were talking about how much people paid for these experiences and how much it contributed to conservation. Then they compared that to tourism and said, okay, what's tourism bringing to the table? And tourism was bringing like 7% of the overall income, and hunting was bringing in 93%. So her beef was, why does it have to be that money comes in to help protect these animals and put them in place? Why does it have to be from hunters? Why can't it be from tourism? They're just reinforcing the wrong industry. It's like, no, the tourism dollars just aren't there. There's no tourist that's willing to pay $40,000 5 times
to look at something.
And she's like, well, why can't they just be altruistic and just, donate the money?
It's not human nature.
It's not. It's like you want these things to be in place that just don't exist.
Why can't the world be a perfect place?
And so I listened to her.
Susan, why can't it be?
It just irritated me. Yeah. And so she's going on and on about this in this video. And she says, okay, so the population gets too much. You're right. It's a finite piece of property. It's fenced to keep basically poachers from killing the black rhinos that are endangered and the other species that are on these grounds. Yep. They have to kill the lions and different critters because they're in a fence. Not because they want them to be, but you live in a third world country that's where poaching is bad and where you get a lot of money if you kill a rhino and take its horn. And
got a bunch of hungry Chinese rebels out there.
You have a situation that is unique, and we're talking about how can we save the animals. And when you walk out there and you see this, they show just tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres, right?
There's like the size of some European countries.
Right, in a fence. And they're managing this and they're protecting it against poachers, and that costs a lot of money. And they pull up to a train depot, and there's a train car full of rhinos that have been killed. And these are all the rhinos that have been killed and then illegally harvested. Mm-hmm. And it is just a train car full of heads and stuff. Oof. Skulls, cut off horns. And they're like, these are what we take from poachers. This is what we're fighting against. So when we are out there and we're taking these animals, we're being paid by hunters from all over the world who come and do this. Mm-hmm. Those funds go into protecting these animals. And that place, it's undeniable how rich and full it is of wildlife. And the guy hosting the show, I just wish he did a pretty good job trying to be balanced in his reporting, but he was still biased toward anti-hunting throughout. But he's like, there's a line, imagine a line through the center of this table. This side is the game reserve. This side is public. Mm-hmm. This side is overgrazed, it's dirt as far as you can see. Yep. This side looks like African savanna. It's just incredible wildlife as far as you can see. Mm-hmm. And there's your contrast. And he shows the two. And this woman says from one of these organizations says you could manage the populations by using contraceptives instead. Who's
going to pay for the contraceptives?
Who pays for that? And how do you do that? And when you start neutering all the male lions just so you don't shoot them, that's not a naturally recurring resource either anymore. It doesn't generate income. You've just frozen things in time and asked people to just pay the bills without an income.
Now you probably have some alpha lions shooting blanks and stopping other lions that can actually reproduce.
It's just such a bizarre worldview where you let your feelings get in the way of science, getting in the way of nature. Like, I hate to break it to her, but we eat meat.
We live in a delusional world, Brian. Food is not in a grocery store. That's not normal. Like, people have the really weird misconceptions about how life really is. The internet really messes that up. Cars really mess that up. People have a big misconception of how the world really works.
Yeah.
And it's reinforced every day. And people, sadly enough, they've become a little delusional.
Well, it's like Joe Rogan when he said, people get weird when they start trucking the food into the cities and dropping it in the stores. Think about it. If you haven't actually gone out and killed a chicken, you know, when you sit down and eat chicken wings, how many people actually think about this was walking around somewhere? It had a life.
Or how about I went and I ate a meal of chicken wings? I got 9-piece chicken wings. Mm-hmm. That's like 3.5 birds are just dead on my plate.
Right. Like, you didn't raise them. You didn't feed them. Mm-hmm. You didn't watch them grow.
You didn't
kill them. You didn't process them. There's a disconnect. Mm-hmm. There's a major disconnect between food and where it comes from. Mm-hmm. Certainly. And it's easy to have these noble notions of saving animals' lives when you live in the luxury of a big fancy home and you can just have food bought and brought to your home.
I'm just going to eat Cheez-Its forever and let them all be happy. Here's the thing. Like, most people eat meat. Mm-hmm. It's like some 90% of Americans eat meat. It's like a large amount.
Right. Correct. Okay. 95% or something.
How many of those people have actually killed an animal and ate it?
Very few.
Very few. And
hunters,
of
7%,
course.
10% maybe.
7 to 10% of the population,
I'm not
maybe.
Sure.
You got some farmers, you know. Let's be gracious. 20%.
Okay.
We'll double the number we're talking about.
Yeah.
20% of the U.S. population has killed and ate something themselves. That means 80% of the people out there have never killed something and eaten it.
Some of them have never seen something killed.
That's true. But they eat meat on a regular basis. That causes a delusional sense of how the world really works.
Right. Absolutely.
If you've been to
like when you go to Asia and they have those meat markets hanging outside and they have all this fish or all these dead animal parts, you're acutely aware of this is a living thing. Yeah. They pull a lobster out of or a crab out of a bin of water and then they just crack it over and then they give it to you. Mm-hmm. It's a different, you're acutely aware of it being alive. So, here, it's all wrapped in cellophane. It's super clean. There's
meat. It's not an animal, Brian. It's meat.
Right.
It's an object.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a feeling.
I'll never forget the day I decided that it was game meat for me forever was when I went and toured the ConAgra slaughterhouse in Greeley, Colorado. And I was a consultant and I had to audit the facility. And so you go into the facility.
Okay, because you've talked about this before, and there are huge gag laws associated with slaughterhouses. And I was always wondering how you got in there.
Because they hired me to do their audits, because they have to have independent audits performed. When you go into a slaughterhouse, you have to go into it from the clean end and you work your way to the dirty end.
So you mean you start off with processed packaged meat, and then you start off with a live or end
Because
with live animal.
as you go in reverse, you cannot contaminate the area in reverse.
Yeah.
But if you go the other way, you could bring germs and contamination and stuff up through the process, right?
Yep.
So you start at the end where where it's in boxes and it's being inventoried in this giant freezer space. And it was something like from the Matrix, dude.
Yeah.
You walk in and it's just this giant thing, and there's these boxes on conveyor belts, these arms grab boxes and then go through this and store it up on certain shelves. And it looked like it was futuristic. I'll get to it later, but they know if where that box is of meat that was part of which cow it came from. So that if they detect some problem with the cow, some disease or bacteria or something,
or maybe that cow is exposed to other cows,
they can grab all the meat that was associated with that, and they know exactly where it's at, and they can remove it from the...
Humans are so cool and terrifying all at the same time.
Yeah. So then you go to the next phase and the next phase. Anyway, as I walk through the place, okay, the smell progressively goes from one way to the next until you get to the very end, and it's the cow walking into like a chute, and the guy has this big like two-handed gun that he's pointing at the cow's head, and he hits a button and it like shoots a piston through the skull and just brains it, and it drops. But the heart still pounds and still works. So then they string it up and let it bleed out and cut it, and it starts going down through the process. But the smells, man, cows being filthy. The cows would come in double-decker trailers, and the top cows, and it might take 3 days, 4 days for them to drive there. The top cows are crapping on the bottom cows. And when those bottom cows come in, it's not like they clean them off. They're just covered in piss and crap. And then they walk them in and they just like slaughter them, and all that, the smells and the death. It's intense, man. It's intense. Now, when you get to the part of the floor where it's just a hind leg, it's like, oh, meat just looks like meat. And then they butcher it and they cut it into pieces, and it's like, oh, there's a steak and you're going to have that. No. But as you go in reverse, you start to see the animal become whole, and you see how they mass produce it, mass butcher it. It is wild.
They process a lot of cows every day.
I think it was 5,000 pigs a day and 2,000 cows a day.
I'm more alarmed by the cows than the pigs. Like, pigs have no souls. I feel like we're just doing them a favor. They're so ugly.
Cows are dumber than a rock, so it's sort of... pigs are smarter than cows. They're just not as evil. I mean, they're more evil than cows.
Yeah.
It's interesting. But when I saw the process, I thought, I don't want an animal that is raised on a farm, on a food lot. They're injected with hormones and various things.
Well, they have to be injected with antibiotics nonstop because you have cows literally pooping on top of each other.
And then when they all come through and you see the butcher process, and you see maybe those cows mostly ate corn most of their lives on feedlots, it created a severe distaste in my mouth. And to contrast that, a month before I had gone and done that audit, I had shot an elk in desolation unit with cousin Ben, in Oregon, and I had killed it in the wild, butchered it, and brought it home. My freezer was full of elk meat. And here I am looking at this and looking at that, and I'm going, wow, there is a stark contrast here. That's when I decided I can do it a more natural way. It's within my ability to do it. And connect with nature at the same time. And I just saw a much better way of impacting the environment than participating in the mass production of meat. At the same time, I mean, I understand we live in a world where not everyone, if everyone decided they could hunt or would hunt, we wouldn't be able to sustain the wildlife, and there's not enough to feed the entire population. There is a necessity in today's world to have feedlots and to have some of these things in place where we mass produce food. You got to wonder how necessary, and if hunting is managed really well across the world, at least we could minimize the need and the reliance on that type of farming and ranching, you know. And it's not to vilify either one, ranching or farming, you know. But when I look at within an individual's ability, hunters have the ability to go out and get all their own food. It carries with it a tremendous, I think, life value.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really that was kind of a sidebar to the discussion about, as hunters, we do a lot for conservation, and our game agencies do, and we continue to work on that, including the obscure species that, you know, just aren't going to generate revenue for us. They're a cost without a big return in terms of finances. I wish that we were recognized for those things more, our positive impact on wildlife, because these anti-hunting agencies want to paint us as takers and killers and murderers. Mm-hmm. But it's not fair and it's not true. We actually put our money where our mouth is in a way that they don't. They get a lot of funding, and they do it by preying on the sympathies of people by showing, you know, wolves being shot, and then save the wolf, which doesn't need it. The squirrel needs it. Mm-hmm. And yet they're not going to bother with that. It's all fake stuff that preys on the sympathy and the emotions of others. But the more we can share what we know about conservation and what hunters do, mm-hmm. how much we impact wildlife in a positive way, mm-hmm. the better off we are. So here's a little plug for Arizona Wildlife News. You all should get this periodical. It's good stuff. It has a lot of conservation information in it, and it gives you a good feel for what our game agencies do, what Arizona does. I think Arizona is a model agency. They do an excellent job. I love their work. So check that out. That's it. I think we use the code GRITTY for Sissy Sticks. Use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside. Use the code GRITTY at Heather's Choice, Graxaw Game Bags, and Valkyrie Arrows. Those are all partners of ours. You can find the link in the description below. All of them support the show. And when you shop there, helps us do what we do too. And they're great products. So check that out. Support us by going out there and subscribing to the newsletter. Support us by using the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops to save if you got some orders and products you want to get at Mountain Ops. And thanks for watching, and stay gritty.